So welcome everyone to our second SE research session. Today we're talking about managing interruptions in engineering teams. And just before we get started, we've teamed up with a company called Clockwise to bring you this session. Clockwise helps optimize your team's calendars to create more time in everyone's day. You can learn more about their product at getclockwise.com. And I'm a co-founder at DX. DX helps organizations measure developer experience and remove friction across engineering teams, tools, and practices. So excited to jump in. Before we do, quick housekeeping items. Today's discussion will largely be spent talking about Duncan's paper and other research. We'll cover the key findings and discuss those. If anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat at any point during the discussion. And then we'll also be sending out the recording afterwards. So with that said, Duncan, welcome. And do you mind starting off by just introducing yourself before we kick off?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to have these kind of conversations and talk about the work we've been doing. So yeah, as it says, my name is Duncan Brumby, professor at University College London. And here I am, halfway between London and Cambridge, joining you on a Friday afternoon. So it's great to beam across without any of the challenges of jet lag. But,
Well, thanks so much for joining. And I know this is your last stop before you head off to Crete for vacation. So
yeah, looking forward to that. Thank you.
So let's dive in. You've done a lot of research in this area and published a lot of work. Today we'll kind of start with this sort of summary paper or essay that you put together fairly recently. Maybe just provide a high-level overview. What was this article about?
Sure thing. So this was came out as an output from a workshop where a whole bunch of us got invited to hang out in this castle in South Germany, which is really nice. Dachstuhl it's called. And what it is, it's funded by the German government, and you basically hang out there and you talk about research for a week, and in the evening, relax and go for long walks and this kind of stuff. It's really quite nice. The focus of that was around measuring productivity in software developers, and it was bringing people from the big tech companies like Google, Microsoft together, as well as academic researchers. And as an output of this, they were really motivated to not just do another academic paper, but instead write a series of chapters that could be a book that could be accessible to a broad audience and try to communicate some of the things we know. And that's what this chapter came out. So it's got co-authors Chris Janssen, who's at Netherlands, former PhD student of mine, and Gloria Mark, who's one of the leaders in this field. So definitely worth looking at their work as well in this area at UC Irvine. And so this chapter was kind of like trying to distill some of the big things that we know from studying interruptions and kind of communicate them in a way that's accessible and has some real take homes for people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this was your chapter titled "How Do Interruptions Affect Productivity" was actually, it's worth calling out, a chapter in a larger book focused on sort of aggregating research on developer productivity in general.
Yeah, for sure. And it's quite nice. We were able to get that book published open access, so you don't have to pay for it. It's all there. And some of the chapters are quite short, actually, and they've been really written with this goal of having very takeaway, high-level insights in them that are all based on research. And you've got some of the real leaders in the area, in the field, talking about this stuff and their exciting work in this area.
In your mind, what has inspired your research in this area, and who is the intended audience for this paper in particular, or this chapter?
The intended audience, yeah. So, we've been doing work on multitasking and interruptions for by this point, a good 10, 15 years. And that was motivated. I'd initially done some work in driver distraction. So looking at how people use phones while driving and the different ways in which that can affect performance. We'd also done stuff looking at interruptions in healthcare settings. So nurses getting distracted when they're programming infusion pumps. That was a big project we're a part of. So a whole bunch of different contexts. Gloria Mark here has led quite a lot of work working with companies, going into places like open planned offices in places like Microsoft and studying how those developers and managers manage their interruptions in their daily work. So between the team, we've got a number of years experience in this area. The intended audience for this book, though, was, again, it's kind of getting to that broader audience of trying to so I lead a master's program in human computer interaction. So obviously I was thinking about the students, but also practitioners as well. We're trying to hit, and that was the people that were leading the book who were based at Google. They were really focused on practitioners with that in mind So having takeaway insights that people could apply in work.
So this paper was sort of a, overview of a lot of the prior and existing research you've done in this area. Can you talk about, as you approach this summary, what you talk about, for example, all the different ways in which interruptions have been studied. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I in some ways, what I really love about this chapter is it was a real opportunity to take on board some of the things I've been spending a number of years thinking about. So I'm in an area called human-computer interaction. I came from a tradition of experimental psychology where we do controlled experiments in the lab. They're often quite boring, actually. But what you learn from this is you learn things about people's memory, their attention, this kind of stuff. And so you get some like really big classic findings about what people can and cannot do, right? And our limitations. And that's the kind of tradition I was brought up in. At the same time, you've got this kind of other tradition of work, which is going into workplaces, watching people, studying them, talking to them in person while they're doing stuff in the situation. And this is more qualitative research. And what this chapter did is, and what's really quite, I think, unique in this area of interruptions is that you've got these two big bodies of research that have been done in these two different traditions. Controlled studies, where you learn about, does a longer interruption have worse effects? What about the type of interruption? What about what the nature of the interruption, whether the interruption is relevant or not? All these kind of factors, all the things you could think about an interruption have been studied in a tradition of these experiments. And that's then also been complemented by this other tradition of work, which has gone in there and looked at people working. And, a really famous paper by Gloria Mark got to this number of like people get interrupted or self-interrupt every 3 minutes to 11 minutes. It's really quite frequently. So we find it very hard to focus our attention. So you kind of get this from just watching people work.
As you've done research in this area and you put together this summary, what were like the key sort of research questions, if you will? What are the big questions for practitioners or for other researchers that you were really aiming to kind of address?
The big question. So some of the things that we've looked at, well, one of the in terms of like the geeky research question, one of the things that we're super interested in is how people make decisions about how to manage interruptions. And I think that's one of the things that's difficult to really study. And we've made some progress in that. So you see this happening in real life, right? So if somebody walked in from the door behind you, you'd probably be like, no, not now. You'd take a moment to pause, and then there'd be some kind of negotiation taking place. But then it depends on what the nature of that interruption is, and you make these kind of decisions very quickly. I think that kind of discretionary nature of how people manage and coordinate interruptions, both with people coming in, but this is what our I can't find my phone now, but this is what our devices are doing all the time, right? They're providing all sorts of notifications. And, you watch what they do. I've now got my lovely do not disturb symbol on there to try and get some peace and quiet. But, they've made this really quite complicated. You've got no fewer than do not disturb, personal, sleep, work. I'm an expert in this area. I've got no idea what the difference between personal, work, sleep. I don't even know what that really means. I get the idea that I can go and program it to do different things. Do I do that? Probably not. If I don't do it, I don't know who is. But they thought about this. So I think there's an interesting space there about how people navigate. Both digital interruptions are really important, but I think we learn about how people manage interruptions, how digital interruptions are made by looking at how people manage people walking into rooms and how they manage those kind of interruptions that are coming in the physical environment, because they should be more or less lining up.
That's really interesting. I'm curious then, and you touched on this in your paper, what are some studies that stand out, both in both types that you've sort of mentioned earlier? What are maybe the major studies that stand out to you that
okay. Yeah, so some of the stuff that's talked about in the qualitative research that's looking at people working in open planned offices, we learn that interruptions are really common. So, and people are tapped on the shoulder and asked questions by their co-workers all the time. And if it's not that, then actually we and then you could say, well, post-COVID, a lot of us are still, I'm at home, you're at home, working at home. Doesn't need somebody to come walking into the room. We'll just interrupt ourselves. So we'll stand up and go for a walk. We'll just simply get our phone out and start doing some other. So actual focused work, these periods are quite brief. I think that's one of the main things that we learn from this body of work, that we get this idea that people should be really, really focused on their work for hours and hours on end. The reality from research is that you see people really doing focused, deep work for like 10 minutes at a time, and then they take a little break. So I think that's kind of one of the major insights. And then you get to the place of looking on the other side, the experiments. You're learning about how people are responding to interruptions, the duration, the frequency, whether a task that's more similar to what you're doing. And this is where you get into the space of, well, if I'm interrupting you to tell you something that's relevant to your current task, is that going to make it easier for you to switch back in? One of the big insights from the experiments is that returning from an interruption it involves a lot of memory. You have to remember what you're doing. So it's been demonstrated that retrieval process, or remembering, is easier if you're not having to do big context switches. I mean, that's so I'm going to go for one more, and maybe actually let you come in with another question actually first.
I was really just going to dig into that further and ask, for practitioners out there, maybe could you provide examples of what are the problems and maybe benefits of interruptions?
Perfect. So the problem is it's email, or things that look like email. Email has been shown over and over again to be mega stressful. And so there's some nice studies where they've taken email away from people and they're a lot calmer. You get people to batch their email, they're a lot calmer. Email is one of these things that's super stressful for people. And the reason why it's stressful is because it requires a lot of these context switches. You never know what's next. You know what it's like? You sit down and you triage your email and it's like, okay, that can be deleted. That's an easy response. And then you're like, oh no. And then you deal with that one. And then suddenly it's even bigger. So there's this feeling of just like what's around the corner. And it requires that constant mindset change as you kind of engage. And a lot of this stuff, dealing with complex problems, obviously the more senior you are in an organization, the more complex the requests that are being made of you are. And it takes time to kind of like reconstruct what was going on there, right? The narrative, what were the issues, who was involved, what did they say last time? And it's kind of rebuilding up context. So these context switches are super, super challenging for people. And moving through them very rapidly, like triaging email or other forms of digital communication like that. So, I think you could say if email is challenging, the moment you start moving over to things like Slack or direct messaging, it just gets even harder because people expect an instantaneous response from those. So they are, and I think that we know that they are challenging. They have benefits because they keep teams talking frequently, but they are definitely challenging. And I think research shows that.
What about the self-interruptions?
Yeah, self-interruptions are great. So this is where, procrastination, right, is the most extreme version of this. It's I'm a professor in a university. I work with a lot of students, and it's fascinating to watch them because they set themselves for the first time this kind of their agenda for the summer of how they're going to work, and they kind of set this very ambitious goal, and then it's not quite met, and it's like next week's going to be different, and so yeah, I think it's hard to get into work and to plan work. We've been doing research recently on people's planning behavior. So we had a couple of research papers just published last year looking at getting people to keep a diary of the work tasks they're going to do in a day. So they write down at the beginning of the day, what do you want to get done today? And then at the end of the day, you write another summary that says what you actually achieved. And what you can do there is you can start, especially if they give a lot of detail, you can say, what's the delta, if you like, between what they hope to get done and what they actually got done. Probably won't surprise you to realize that most people don't get their to-do list finished each day. They get about halfway through it. But critically, the amount of time planning is super tricky as well. Some tasks are very easy to plan. So meetings, you schedule an hour, you're going to keep within the hour. But other things like writing or email again is another cursed one. You think I'm going to do half an hour of email. Suddenly it's 3 hours have gone by. If people really knew how much time they were spending on email, they'd be astonished by the total amount of time it consumes each day. And you don't notice it so much because you tend to do it in these little blocks throughout the day. But so, yeah, we've done some really nice work there around people's ability to plan and the types of tasks which are, people aren't very good at planning. So, it's interesting, your partner there was talking about how to schedule people's time and help the diary management problem. And that's a super fascinating problem, I think, really fascinating problem, because you've got some things which are very tightly constrained. You can make good predictions about, I'm going to be doing this for 1 hour, I'm going to do this for 3 hours, I'm going to be clear at this time. But other tasks, so it depends on what your work is and your role in an organization, your ability to plan your work is quite susceptible to the nature of the work you're doing.
Have you looked at or been involved with any research to sort of put a dollar cost on like interruptions in business or in other settings?
Oh, no, I've not put a dollar, but you could say it'd be high. I mean, we do know from the basic research that interruptions slow down productivity. I mean, that's the main, I guess that's the headline finding from those, I talked about those basic psychology experiments, and every time they've been run, what it shows is that you work on a task and then somebody interrupts you and gets you to do something else. And then you deal with the interruption, come back to your main task. There is a recovery time to re-engage with that main task. And that's been called the resumption lag. So the time it takes you to resume a task. And that is wasted time. So if the more and more you're interrupted, you pay for it in this resumption time. And that resumption time is basically the mentally switching and getting back into the task. It takes time, right? And it takes effort. So that's definitely lost productivity. And you could potentially put a dollar amount on that. I think the trouble is that people are complex. So I think there have been, this is where you get into the realm of talking about productivity. The more you really try to get people to maximize every minute, then they find other ways of, then they self-interrupt more, because we just need a break, right? And some of the chapter talks about this kind of replenishing our kind of cognitive reserves, if you like. So yeah, people do get fatigued, and that needs to be accounted for.
I really like that term, resumption lag. I need to start using that. Before we record this webinar, you had mentioned something about power dynamics. You had mentioned that managers and ICs view interruptions differently, and as a result, have maybe sometimes conflicting or different strategies for how to manage interruptions.
Yeah.
What are your opinions or observations on that?
Yeah, I think you can't help but kind of reflect on when you see in an organization that it depends on the organizational structure, but the type of setting that I'm used to working in is one which has a traditional kind of pyramid structure, if you like. And it's fascinating when you get to things like scheduling meetings, or things when people can be late. It's often related to seniority, right? The meeting is scheduled by the most senior person in the room, or the most senior person on the meeting. They're the one that takes precedent. And that's, I think we picked up on this when we were talking before a little bit. And when going back to this chapter again, so here I'm just going to show it quickly on the screen here. So chapter 11 here, Dark Agile. It's a really nice chapter, actually. And this is some work coming out of Denmark at University of Copenhagen. And it's qualitative research. It's going off and doing interviews with people who work for software companies, Danish companies that then have satellite offices, or they have people that they've outsourced work to in other countries. And they talk about, how things like, in particular, because it's focusing on agile, so it's talking about scrums and daily stand-ups, and how these are kind of dictated by the time zone of the lead organization, if you like. And so people that are kind of working in these other places basically have to adjust and stay up. And there's some quite I remember at the meeting some really quite rich stories there about how people would have to stay in the office till 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and then basically then have to work to get home over several hours. And so it's quite challenging, and it's not, arguably that's not going to be great for anyone's productivity, staying up till 3-4 o'clock in the morning for a daily stand-up, right?
Oh, that sounds terrible. So what are your recommendations for leaders and managers who, whose work involves sort of creating interruptions by design, but knowing that these interruptions are, costly?
Yeah, I think you need to think carefully about the work that you're expecting people to. If you're thinking about managers, you need to think carefully about the work that you're expecting, the deliverables you're expecting, what the work entails. Deep work So when do you want people to really think? And you need to schedule and give them time to do that. There is a big focus on distributed teams, and methods like Agile encourage things like daily stand-ups and various, and a lot of the communicate, it's all about instantaneous communication. And I get it, especially, during the COVID era, we're all working from home, and you want to have oversight. You want to know that people are kind of at their computer, that they're working, that they're talking. And it's become almost this obsession with making sure that people are communicating frequently. But in doing so, there's a real danger that you burn people's time for actual focus. And the evidence of this is that people are telling you that, whenever, I get my real work done at 11 p.m. when everyone else is that's an indicator that something's not happening right in your day, right? If people are having to shift their real focused work, the stuff that they're actually delivering, until the early hours, because they feel that's quiet time to enable them to give them that 2-3 hour run at something without having to stop. I don't know about you, but the idea of I always feel sometimes I sit down and it's like, okay, I've got 45 minutes, or I've got 20 minutes, I'm going to try it, but you just end up not doing what you need to get done in that time, because you're going to have to stop in a moment. Personally, I'm quite lucky, I think, being a professor, so we get to manage our own time quite a lot. So that's quite good. And so thinking about how to manage your schedule, I think, becomes an interesting problem. So the extent to which you can kind of plan busy days, talking days, and have more quiet, deep work days. One of my former students, Sandy Gould, who we've done a lot of work with, he would literally come to the office. This was a long time ago, pre-pandemic. But even then, 2014 or so, he'd come to the office 1 day a week. So he would stay at home doing his research and writing for 4 days. And for 1 day, he'd come up and talk to everyone and be there the entire day, nonstop talking to everyone, making all those connections. But I think this is important, particularly as we're thinking about, transitioning to hybrid work, returning to the office. There's this question about how many days a week you'll be returning to the office. And I think that is the nature of it. Like, I now go in 1 day a week, 2 days a week, and it's a very social day filled with meetings. But then the kind of home day is try to keep focused for that kind of more deep work. So I think managers that are able to empower people to kind of make these decisions, I think that's a good move.
What about sort of email and communication related interruptions? What are strategies for dealing with those?
Again, it goes down to the batch. There's a tension, right? One side of a lot of it, what research does is it highlights trade-offs. It doesn't tell you, the world isn't that simple. You can't say, do this and you'll be happy, do this and it'll be perfect. It's not like that. What research does is highlights the trade-offs. So it highlights the strengths and the weaknesses. So what we know from research, if you start batching these things, so doing email once a day, having a set time for it, you're going to be less stressed. You're going to get through it faster. And we published a paper on this a bunch of years ago. You sit there and you blast it, you're going to do it more effectively. You're not going to be very happy after that hour or two of doing it in a go, because it's going to be quite stressful, but you are just going to contain it. But then the downside of that is that you're going to have this feeling of being out of the loop, and you might miss stuff, and particularly time critical stuff. So it's not going to be right for everyone. It's not going to be right for every project. So I think that's the kind of thing. So it comes back to, again, thinking carefully, what are the requirements for your team? Do people need to be keeping up on each other's daily activities and by the minute? Are things moving that quickly? Or can it instead be more of, I'll just do this once a day, but when I do it, and I've got, colleagues that do this, they say, I'm going to do email like once a day. When they get to it, they give you an actual meaningful response, right? Rather than the constant grazing, eating the junk, eating the snacks, where it's, you're eating it frequently, but you're just handing out, right, I'll get back to you, or that sounds good, the briefest of responses. So that's something to think about, but it comes down to the nature of the work and what's being achieved here. The trouble is with email, though, and all these things, is that they're so multiple things live in your inbox. So getting this separated out is challenging.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about sort of the quality of the communication or responses being degraded when people are just trying to get through it very quickly. So when people aren't using proper punctuation, it's a good sign that they're over interrupted potentially. And that kind of goes into my next question. So if you're a manager or leader listening to this, and so you've given a great overview of how, there's imperfect trade-offs here related to interruptions. So as a leader, how do you know where you are on that spectrum? Like, how do you know if your team has too many interruptions? Like, what are symptoms or signs you might look for to, know that you need to make a change?
Great question. Well, I think some of it comes back to what I said, like asking people when they get their best work done. That could be that could be an informative question. I think the issue is whether people will give you an honest answer or not. So I think the first thing comes from culture. You need to create a team environment where people are going to be quite open and honest. And that's difficult, right? Because, particularly if there's performance reviews and that kind of, people might try to present an image. So creating an environment where people can share these kind of things is quite important. But yeah, getting a sense of what I think you could step away from the individuals, think about what the nature of the work is, right? Why is the communication necessary, and what's its goal? And how does it serve the company mission? So for some teams, I think, as you say, you do get this nature of there needs to be fast back and forth because things need to be scheduled in real time. But for other things, it is a question of just putting it onto the stack, right? And then you get to the large, the bloat that comes with just so much of this is just noise as well. And so there's been so many attempts to filter out either outside spam or institutional spam within that's another challenge, is paying attention to what's important. Is one of the, it's not a problem that's ever going to go away.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, just being mindful of the schedules of your team and the rituals, as well as just asking team members about their preferred, when they do their best work and optimizing for that.
Yeah.
What about,
yeah, and you do get,
ahead.
sorry, just to jump in and to say, I think there is something as well about individual differences. I mean, that's there's some nice research been done looking at kind of like we joke about morning people and evening people, but there's something behind that, right? You do get the impression that some people do. I've got a colleague who gets up at 4 a.m. and does that. I would never do that, right? But I'm quite happy to stay up till 2 a.m. So you get these kind of, allowing for that kind of flexibility. But again, it's trade-offs. You could allow for that, but then, getting people to come back together again, and what's the agreement there to get buy-in for people to come together when they need to come together to do valuable work together?
Yeah, that makes sense. So building on some of those signals we talked about, or things you can observe, are there more kind of hidden symptoms of interruption? So let's say your developers aren't really telling you, they're not giving you much as far as, there are times of day that they do their best work, and you look at the calendar and it doesn't seem like there are that many meetings. How else might you be able to sort of detect that interruptions are occurring, right? Like, for example, do interruptions lead to burnout, or are there sort of like indirect symptoms or outcomes that are caused by interruptions that a leader might be able to observe?
It's a great question. Well, we know that people work on multiple projects, right? So that's going to be one challenge, is that people are juggling multiple activities. And this goes down to the side of why interruptions happen, and why, not just interruptions, but why do people multitask? And it makes sense. We need to get by with monitoring. Our lives are rich and complex, and it's not that you just dedicate yourself to one. In fact, that's odd, just dedicating yourself to one thing only. That's the condition, right? So instead, we have these rich, diverse lives where we kind of allocate time to different activities. And so you need to kind of be dividing your attention to some extent. But yeah, your question was more, what are the indicators that people are struggling, essentially? I mean, it's the obvious ones, which is like, are they hitting their performance objectives and appraisals? I mean, that's the kind of classic. It's not really my area. It's a great question, but I don't feel super comfortable answering it. But I think it is a good question. But yeah, I think there is a lot of stuff out there in around productivity and how you measure productivity, and some of the challenges around productivity that people could look at. But yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, no, I think that really answers it. You're suggesting that you would kind of observe some indicators of interruptions that actually be reflected in the indicators of performance or productivity. that an organization is looking at. That makes sense. I'm curious, as far as this chapter you wrote and the broader book, what's the industry reception of this been like?
It's great. I mean, this is why I'm talking to you here today. So I was really delighted when you guys reached out to me. I was like, yes, this is exactly what we hoped for. So thank you again. It's really nice. Yeah, so it's, we get indicators like how much is being read and downloaded, and it seems to be having a nice impact, which is good in those types of metrics that we see. So it's hitting an audience, which is good. And I think it provides a useful, it's doing multiple things. It's talking about some key insights that people can learn, highlighting how interruptions are disruptive and that people take time to recover from them and that they can cause stress and this type of stuff. But one of the things that we also wanted to do is to not just take what the findings are, and this comes up a lot when I'm, got my professor hat on and talking to students, is to think about how do we know stuff? It's one thing to say, this is what research shows, but I think to really train a critical mind, you've got to be always asking yourselves, how did they get to that conclusion? What was the research methodology or the approach that was taken? What was the data that was gathered? How was that data gathered that allowed them to make those claims? So that was my secret agenda here, was it to basically be a research methods in disguise chapter as well. So there's elements there of reflection around different methods, the types of insights you get from methods, strengths and limitations of methods, because I think when you're trying to apply knowledge, you need to think about where that knowledge has come from and how it was generated.
That's really interesting. What research going forward are you doing yourself or know about that's exciting and people should be aware of in this area?
Wonderful question. Okay, so yeah, I've already told you about the stuff so we've done some nice stuff with the planning, and this work was looking at how people plan, but then the pandemic came along, so we looked at how people transitioned to working from home and how that affected their planning work. So that's some really exciting work, and we're starting to also look at tools, so all these apps that exist to help people plan their work, and we're doing reviews of those and seeing, informed by theory, which features are really helpful there. So that's kind of work that's ongoing at the moment, which we're super excited about. Another branch of what we're looking at is again kind of thinking about this kind of future of work theme, if you like. There's been a lot of interest in obviously transitioning people to work from home, but also looking at the gig economy. So crowdsourcing platforms, Uber, I suppose, is the biggest one you can think of in the space, where it's the apps there are allowing people to work as freelancers essentially, but you get this across things like Upwork as well, and Amazon Mechanical Turk is another thing. So there's lots of these platforms exist out there. So how does this work? And so we're doing a lot of work at the moment, looking at how people find work, do work, and particularly on these platforms where they are their own agent, they're a freelancer, and they're dividing multiple projects. They're doing a lot of multitasking. They're dividing their time between looking for work and doing work, all while being on the clock. And so that's some really exciting work that's been occupying a lot of our attention recently in the team.
Well, we'll very much look forward to that. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on today and speaking to me and the rest of the audience about your work. I think it's been a really interesting discussion and lots of applicable insights. So we appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. It's real nice to talk to you.